Hello, friend. I hope you're well and doing everything within your power to stay sane this week. I have something that may or may not help, but it certainly will clarify topics that have been relevant as of late. Continuing on in our emotion series, today we're going to talk about hostility, which is generally regarded to be a very negative emotion. Of course, feelings are not good or bad, they are just trying to signal something to us, but this one is particularly contentious and complicated. And I know I'm probably going to say this for every single one of these books, but this one, for real, actually is my favorite, though. If you don't read any of the other ones, this might be the one to do. I learned an awful lot from this book, and also from Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. And just the study of human irrationality is infinitely fascinating and both very unnerving and comforting at the same time. I think there is definitely a benefit to trying to understand the mechanics of it, because ultimately these feelings are not good or bad. We have them because they work and because they do something for us. And so hostility is a mechanism on the fire axis which is responsible for threat evaluation and trying to determine whether someone is in your in-group or out-group and whether they should be greeted with hostility or to be trusted. And so, as with all the cards, we're going to go through just what's on it to begin with. So this is a very distributed activation. As you can see, it's got very high activation in the face, although it is not symmetrical, which is very interesting. And you see a lot more concentration here on the left side. And then you also see high elevation here in the diaphragm area, upper stomach, duodenum kind of area, kind of that burny, heartburn type of region. And the body language that I chose to go with this is, of course, the defensiveness of the hand on the hip and the accusatory finger pointing that goes with the gestures of hostility. So the definition part is aversion to contact, opposition, or aggression toward incoming stimuli. So at the end of the day, this is an emotion that's trying to protect us and prevent harm. So the colloquial terminology for this one are a powder keg, having a short fuse, being quick-tempered, unapproachable, rough around the edges, hot under the collar, or having an itchy trigger finger. So this is one of those really clear fire axis temperature descriptors. And the quote is from Elliot Aronson and Carol Tavris. It doesn't say that on the card, but this is a dual author situation. And stop me if you've heard this one. Children learn to justify their aggressive actions early. They hit a younger sibling who starts to cry and immediately claim, "But he started it. He deserved it." A vicious cycle is created. Aggression begets self-justification, which begets more aggression. And so the title of the book is Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me: Why We Justify Foolish Beliefs, Bad Decisions, and Hurtful Acts. And this is the edition that has the additional somewhat politically charged last chapter added. Very relevant, very important, and as I said, I think everybody should read it just to understand the extent to which they themselves are capable of all of these behaviors. We all do it, and the extent to which you claim that you don't do it or you're above and beyond and exempt from this is the extent to which you are doing exactly this behavior, right? Because you're trying to sell yourself and rationalize your trustworthiness or your righteousness rather than just demonstrating it through trustworthy behavior and being safe and being able to disarm. Because when we are clinging to these justifications and we're trying to prop ourselves up and appear more virtuous, in fact, that's a form of arming ourselves and it's putting on this virtue signal defensiveness, which is actually what you don't want to do. And the more practice that you become in doing it, the more hostile that you actually become, and more ideological and more prickly and rough around the edges and difficult to approach, because you're setting up these parameters through judgment rather than through setting healthy boundaries. So this is a really great book talking about very practical ways to kind of actually do this. And like I said, Predictably Rational also really demonstrates kind of the practical applications. I love that book because I learned a lot about business and a lot about like pricing psychology and just customer experience and like these things I hadn't really considered as psychological before. I just had all of my judgments and my expectations and what I thought I wanted as a customer. And then actually learning all of these things about the emotionality of purchases and about decision fatigue and about like what is the optimum number of options to be offered that is both respectful of your autonomy as a person and being able to have different choices and, you know, make your own decisions, but not bombarding you, you know, and how there's actually an awful lot of diplomacy and respect, even in the way that you present yourself and the way that you negotiate. And it really kind of elucidated for me how poor, at least for Americans in our culture, how very little upbringing we have from our parents, from the school system, from the whole of it, in really being skillful negotiators first and foremost, and kind of the difference between our culture and perhaps other ones in the world when it comes to like a sense of autonomy in collectivism rather than the rugged individualism, bootstraps kind of thing, and how my conclusions have kind of been that the foundation of sovereignty and respect and negotiation in this collective sense of just being very forthright with people, being able to articulate and lay out options and boundaries and just be very transparent about those. And here are my expectations. Here's what I would want from you. Here's what a contract would look like between us and how I would expect you to show up in it. Here's what I will do if you do not show up in the way that I have negotiated for and expected. We're not very skillful at that. That's not a skill that's taught. And that's an emotional regulation skill. And that has to do with hostility. And hostility, I think, primarily comes from a expectation that there is some sort of universal goodness or moral purity standard that everybody is just psychic and knows and adheres to. And the only way that we kind of have figured out how to do these negotiations without doing any of the emotional labor or doing any of the work, to just talk to one another simply and figure out what we all need and want, is to create these in-groups and out-groups and these labels and tags that make it very easy to set up these parameters of expectation and then feel very betrayed and like our boundaries have been violated when somebody doesn't live up to those expectations as far as the definition of whatever that group tends to be. And it's kind of it's a necessary shortcut when you live in a big advanced society, and I think a lot of it stems from the agrarian revolution and the need to come up with weights and measures and standards and definitions and kind of the tendency toward desiring a higher authority and laws and rules and all of that. And we do need that as a society to some extent, but I think it needs to be accompanied by an awful lot of thoughtfulness about where that ends and where individual responsibility picks up, and what that boundary really is. Because if you don't have that and all you have is this constant appeal to authority, I'm not going to go too deeply into that because, of course, that falls under the Nemesis Project, which I referenced before, which is exploring the roots of evil. But appeal to authority is one of those. That's part of that slippery slope that leads us into the temptation of dehumanization. And so, like, on one hand, we do need to establish certain standards and authority about we're not going to tolerate murder. We're not going to tolerate these kind of illegal things. This is what constitutes a crime. A society is setting up a boundary, hopefully in some kind of agreed upon consensual way of like, this is what the crime, this is what the punishment, here are the expectations, here's what happens if you violate it. So you have to have some kind of society-wide agreement of that for certain behaviors. But then on the individual level, the extent to which you rely solely on an appeal to authority as far as your in-group for those definitions, and that you don't treat one another with a sense of mutuality and respect and curiosity, is the extent to which you are not practicing the emotional regulation of grace and forgiveness and, a healthy level of tolerance and negotiation ability. You're not learning how to ask really good questions about getting clarity on what the other person wants, and you also desensitize yourself and start to not care what the other person wants, and you have no desire to help them get it or want to be in any kind of reciprocity. But it's really interesting, and it's been interesting studying this from a business angle, especially, is a lot of business kind of strategy, and you might feel like, oh, this is very manipulative, or this is a psyops thing. Like, no, this is just how we do this, and it's how we're wired to do this, and this is how it works. A lot of businesses will give you a freebie or a trial or something to feel like a gift, because once you have received a gift, or once you have had some kind of gesture of generosity directed towards you, your willingness to reciprocate and to give back and to want to enter into that negotiation is greatly enhanced. So businesses will really readily do this and try to form trust with you. And I think it's really interesting that we don't have more awareness about this as individuals, or don't strive to engage in the societal rituals that used to kind of make this a standard behavior. If you think about when you move, right? You go to a new neighborhood, you're in a new house, everything's still in boxes, you're in and out the door, and there's, a nice neighbor comes over with a fresh plate of cookies, and they're like, hi, welcome to the neighborhood. This used to be a much more, at least here, standard procedure, and the goal of this is to create a sense of inclusion and trust right off the bat, and to maintain kind of a level of familiarity and neighborhood safety. And, there's a lot of discourse lamenting the good old days when you would be sitting out on the front porch and actually making eye contact and saying hello to your neighbors and all this, and how the decline of society is because we don't sit on our front porches anymore and all that. And that's partly really true, because it's a ritual. But there are lots of other ways to reinstate that ritual or to achieve it, even when our dystopian hellscape suburbia architecture doesn't facilitate those kind of organic interactions. The extent to which we pursue one another and try to enter voluntarily into some sort of negotiation just to create connection and rapport, instead of isolating ourselves and closing ourselves off from things that make us uncomfortable. That's what enhances neighborhood safety and preventing people from being marginalized and falling through the cracks and becoming, galvanized and extreme. And it helps to break down this cycle of hostility. But part of what is important in the study of psychology is to remember that, biologically speaking, like, the reason for hostility goes back to these ancestral roots and serves this purpose. And in the case of a lot of our prior arrangements as Homo sapiens, being hunter-gatherers or being more territorial in certain ways, this would have been advantageous to kind of quickly establish those kind of boundaries. But also what's very fascinating in previous versions of ourselves, more tribal versions, is that as much hostility as there were many more rituals, and I've talked about this kind of in other work because of my personal interest in LARP, but there are many rituals, if you look at different tribal civilizations, that explore non-fatal methods of intimidation and boundary setting, and not aggression without violence, without resulting in injury, without actually resulting in death. And this was a very interesting cathartic procedure that we used to have. One of the most famous examples is like counting coup, which is a First Nations tradition, primarily in the plains, often involving some sort of horseback combat, although it doesn't have to, which was usually had some sort of stick implement, and the ability to get very close to your opponent and to strike them in, just scoring a point kind of way. That was a mark of bravery and was actually considered to be, just as illustrious as actually killing the person. It was considered to be quite ballsy, for lack of a less crass term, I guess. But the purpose of this is to overcome some of our ancestral tendencies. If you look at other great apes, especially chimpanzees, who engage in extremely violent territorial escapades, but they will only do so when the odds are very much in their favor and they know it. They're quite petty and cowardly, actually, even by, and that's not just some sort of moral judgment by any objective observation. They will only try to single out an individual and take them down if they have a posse, usually of like 3 large adults. And both males and females do participate in this violence for chimpanzees, but it's predominantly usually a larger proportion of males. And they seek to not only injure, but to usually injure to the point of the individual eventually succumbing. And they do this for kind of social political gain, to take out rivals. And it's pretty much only done when they can bully and isolate, and they are not going to take on the risk of a one-on-one duel or a straight-up fight. And you see this in many species, even competing males for dominance in what we kind of think of as an alpha situation, although it's not usually hierarchical in quite that way. There may be a dominant male. But when it's a duel like this, typically it's a lot more posturing, and it's a lot more seeing who will back down first rather than a real concerted effort to kill the opponent. And I think it's very interesting how we still have a lot of these kind of things. We have a lot of broadcast violence, if you look at things like wrestling and football and everything else. We still have a lot of consumption of violence in our society in these kind of ritualized ways, but we haven't fully integrated that kind of demonic part of ourselves. It's like we're willingly engaging in this type of ritualized violence to work out aggression. We're doing this to come to some sort of boundaries or agreements. And it's kind of ironic that then, in situations like team rivals in football and things like this, the violence does leak outside the rivalry of the teams themselves, and people take to the streets and burn couches and all of these ridiculous things to express their dissatisfaction with the result. But I think it is worth, a concept worth exploring, to find more ritualized combat as a way of sizing each other up, having a kind of a team building experience, really. Like anytime that you're willingly spending some quantity of time and closeness and intimacy, really, with someone that you think of as your opponent, you're creating this whole possibility for actually hashing out your differences and finding out you're not so different after all. And I think it's primarily the unwillingness to spend that kind of time together that creates this divide, although I am by no means advocating for the debate type format of this weird parasocial thing that we do, YouTube and elsewhere. I don't know that that's necessarily the same as spending that kind of quality time. I think it's more like getting with them, cracking a beer, and hashing things out in that kind of old-fashioned way. I certainly think that sharing drinks and food and things like that is a lot of what our ancestors did to alleviate some aggression. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a lot of, like, our facial recognition sensitivity and our ability to read lips and read faces comes from the adaptation that our species made to, one, like cooking food and having that be a more communal activity, and the responsibility for acquisition of calories being so distributed. both, gender roles and everything else, and having that being collective, but then also engaging willingly in this arrangement where the food is consumed communally and being face to face, and spending that kind of intimate time was a really significant bonding activity for tribes. And we continue a lot of those activities to this day, coming together, breaking bread together, being a sanctified thing for diffusing hostility, I think is really significant. So hopefully this helped comfort, maybe at least a little bit, the existence of hostility as being kind of this waypoint or this boundary stone on the way to potential dehumanization, but still having a purpose and being seated very much within this human emotional experience, and getting to also, I don't know if I should probably be showing this more when I do this, but hostility right here is on the far end of this axis of fire, this fear and anger, enemy recognition. That's kind of like the outer boundary. And I did try to, when I organized the feeling flower, go by like the core emotions and then more acute present experiences. And then the outer ring, though it doesn't strictly follow this pattern, is supposed to be kind of more chronic or more debilitating or more consuming chronically type of conditions. So hostility is very much like a pattern that is built up and has to come from some kind of established assumptions or ideology. Although, even just something like a crossed look or, a stink face or something like that can elicit hostility. Usually it's kind of traveling through anger to get there. Whereas I think the difference with hostility is, and what makes it a little more chronic, is you can have hostility without any interaction. You can have it just by reading an inflammatory thing, and you don't have to have any threat or face at all, because it's a little bit more ideological of a thing. Whereas anger, typically you're kind of visually stimulated a little bit more. You're seeing something happen, you feel a great injustice. Whereas like just the baseline hostility, I think, does have to come from certain presupposed assumptions. And so on that note, it's a pretty, in some ways, accessible emotion to work on and work through. And I think that you would have to start to ask yourself some questions if you're experiencing hostility from either side, in either direction, whatever ideology you find yourself prescribing to these days. I think everybody could benefit from spending a little time on it, even those, and maybe especially those that think they're already on the right side of history. I think it's still worthwhile to really sit down with yourself and maybe do some journaling and ask questions like, who am I so upset at right now? What grouping do I think I'm really making? How much time have I personally spent with them? Is this anecdotal? Is this very far removed? Is this an injustice that I'm seeing that has applied to people around me, or is that actually happened to me? And if it's possible or safe to do so, might it be worthwhile to kind of extend a hand and try to interact with someone across the aisle, not in a debate, not I'm going to fix them, change their mind, or anything like that. Just, is there any giving, if we pretend for a minute that we are all a human species and that we're in this together, is there any kind of giving that feels safe or good that could be done just in what seems to be that direction, And I think that that type of, or just a different direction, just giving in general, I think that the act of that giving, what's the worst that could happen, right? Somebody gets fed, something, some bond is strengthened, I think that in a lot of ways that generosity is a bit of an antidote to the pent-up feeling of hostility and how acrid and damaging that can be. To go back to the illustration itself, if you're finding yourself having this kind of chronic burning, seething, it's not exactly healthy for you either. And that's not to say like, oh, you need to forgive, not really for the other person, but for yourself and your own peace of mind. there's kind of something to that, but I think that has more to do with reinforcing your own ability to emotionally regulate. And I do think that kind of the antidote when it comes to hostility, as far as identifying danger, is to take back control by creating some sense of safety, by creating some sense of justice. And I think that ultimately we do that by giving of ourselves in some way. And maybe the only way that feels safe for you is within the context of your own in-group. And if that's a place to start, so be it. But if you're finding yourself really consumed with these feelings, then the first step is to get part of your life back, get part of your own sense of well-being back by actually diffusing the feeling itself. And that would be my recommendation. But also, if you want to really understand it and why it's happening and what to do about it, and perhaps even challenge some of your own preconceived notions, this is a really great place to start. So thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I hope it was somewhat helpful. And I wish you all the peace in the world and comfort of mind in these very interesting times.